To our first AP Art History talking tour. This talking tour will help walk you through the first chapter of Gardner's Art Through the Ages, Art Before History, as well as introduce some key terms and concepts, introduce our course pacing guide, and help get you prepared for the first unit test. Make sure you have your tools ready. Here we have multiple means of digital access along with some nice coffee. And here's what we're actually going to do today together. We are going to look at the course pacing guide. This will walk us through all of Unit 1 through to the first exam. We'll look at some goals and listen to an audio summary of the current chapter. We'll look at related readings and the guide. And then the lecture itself, a tour of Art Through the Ages, Art Before History, Chapter 1. This is from the 13th edition, although any edition post-11 will be fine. And then finally, we'll exit with an audio quiz and some sample media and resources. A review of the guide at the end to see what we've learned and what we might need to go back and reteach ourselves. Alright, so here's our first pacing guide. As you'll notice, some of this is already in the past. You'll also see at the bottom that we're going to be sponsoring some optional AP Art History study labs on Tuesdays in room 609. The first one will be 9-3, that'll be this Tuesday, upcoming Tuesday, and then 9-10 from 3 to 4:30. What we're going to look at in this first talking tour is, of course, prehistory. We did a lot of work in class with the woman of Wollendorf, which is, of course, misspelled there, I see that now, but we're actually going to look deeper into Neolithic areas of both Jericho and monumental architecture, as well as some of the other Paleolithic cave drawings and sculptures, both in the round and relief, that are covered in Art Through the Ages, Chapter 1. Alright, so before we begin, let's look at some of our learning goals. These are important to keep in mind as we get through the chapter. The goal of this chapter, and indeed the goal of Unit 1A, is to help you to understand the origins of art in terms of time period, human development, and human activity. As we've talked in class, art is not created in a vacuum. It comes out of a context of space and time. And indeed, that context changes. And so the meaning of a piece of art can actually change over time. And we'll see that definitely throughout this particular chapter, in which we begin with a pebble that seems to resemble a human face and a grotesque woman that at their time were probably not considered art, but are at this point in human history. We're also going to explore the origins of creativity, representation, and stylistic innovation in the Paleolithic period, with some brief discussions of what we can best presume was happening during the Paleolithic period in terms of artistic representation. And then we are also going to describe the role of human and animal figures in Paleolithic art. And here, of course, we have this torso with a feline head over here on the right to help provide us some visual cues. We're going to examine the materials and techniques of this earliest art-making period, the Paleolithic period, as well as illustrate the differences between Paleolithic and Neolithic art, largely as a result of social and environmental changes. Also, we will seek to understand and evaluate the types of art prevalent in the Neolithic period.
Audio study tools for use with Gardner's Art Through the Ages, 14th edition by Fred S. Kleiner. This is the first chapter, Art Before History, of the audio study tool for Gardner's Art Through the Ages. We will first summarize the chapter and outline major points which you are most likely to be tested on. This will be followed by a series of audio flashcards which will enable you to test your comprehension of key terms in this chapter. Finally, we will end with 5 quiz questions designed to further test your understanding of critical concepts in this chapter. Copyright 2014, Cengage Learning Incorporated. Chapter Summary. The first sculptures and paintings antedate the invention of writing by tens of thousands of years. Paleolithic humans' decision to represent the world around them initiated an intellectual revolution of enormous consequences. No one knows why humans began to paint and carve images, or what role those images played in the lives of Paleolithic hunters. Women were far more common subjects than men, but animals, not humans, dominate Paleolithic art. The works created range in size from tiny portable figurines, such as the so-called Venus of Willendorf, to large, sometimes over life-size, carved and painted representations of animals, as in the caves of Lascaux, Pechmerle, Altamira, and elsewhere in southern France and northern Spain. Paleolithic artists regularly depicted animals in profile in order to present a complete picture of each beast, including its head, body, tail, and all four legs. This format persisted for millennia. Around 9000 BCE, the ice that had covered much of northern Europe for millennia receded. After a transitional period, the Neolithic Age began in Anatolia and Mesopotamia and spread gradually to Europe, where it continued longer in remote places like Stonehenge in England. The Neolithic Age revolutionized human life with the beginning of agriculture and the formation of the first settled communities, such as that at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, where archaeologists have uncovered an extensive town with numerous shrines. Some Neolithic towns also had fortified stone circuit walls, like those at Jericho. In art, the Neolithic period brought the birth of monumental sculpture, notably the painted plaster figurines from Ain Ghazal, and the restored full-size skulls from Jericho. In painting, coherent narratives became common, and artists began to represent human figures as composites of frontal and profile views, another formula that would remain universal for a very long time.
The related reading, of course, for this audio tour is Art Through the Ages, Chapter 1, Art Before History. It's available on Schoology, and it's available now on the class iPads, and it will be available via a shared course Google Drive, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the tour, as well as in class. These are all the same, it's all the same resource, it's just different routes to the resource. In addition, we have some optional supplements that go along quite well with the gardeners if you're finding it a little dry, including Marilyn Stockstad has a different art history book, and you can look at her chapter on prehistoric art, also available on Schoology, as well as Annotated Mona Lisa on prehistoric art. And Annotated Mona Lisa is an absolute wonderful resource that will help follow you throughout the course. And then finally, in addition, Smart History. Smart History is, as we've talked before, the attempt to create an online comprehensive art history resource as well. Alright, so here's our guide. I'll go through this real quick. This is your first guide, and so it's helpful to remind you that each chapter that we go through will have one of these associated with it. And what these guides do is to help outline some of the key ideas, give you some tips on the AP as it relates to the chapter, as well as key terms and the figures that we would wish for you to define and outline. And then finally wrapping up with some sample essays. And these sample essay prompts are both appropriate for the AP short and long essay. Alright, so some key ideas from today's chapter. Prehistoric art's meaning is elusive, meaning that it is hard to track down. So much of what we think about prehistoric art is coming from the context of the contemporary world, certainly the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And so there's a lot of anachronistic looking back. It's not necessarily bad, it's just something to be aware of. And so when we do look at some of these pieces, we have to understand this through the filter of our own biases and our own understandings of culture. The first sculpture and painting predate the invention of writing, and that's indeed one of the primary definitions of prehistory is pre-writing. And so one of the interesting things that we're going to grapple with in this course, and certainly in this chapter, is sort of the concept that art pre-exists writing, that it pre-exists history. There's disagreement among scholars absolutely about why cave dwellers painted their walls, why large stone monuments were created. Stonehenge has a plethora of theories, as do many of the cave dwellings. Earlier theories were that images were painted in order to improve hunting prospects, whether that was through some type of empirical improvement, like there's lots of these animals here, or through some type of magical reasoning involved, that if we draw and represent animals figuratively or figurally, they'll exist in real life. The conclusions and interpretations that any of us draw from these prehistoric pieces, these prehistoric art, is only theoretical. And it is indeed one of the, if not the, most speculative area of art history. Really key concept, and one that we'll be returning to over and over again. Art changes, but it does not get better. The converse of that is, of course, from a contemporary art history point of view, art doesn't get worse either. It simply changes. Alright, so an AP exam, heads up. I'll have some heads up tips and pro tips and micro tips and whatever I'm going to call it that week for the guides. But the AP exam in art history includes thematically based questions throughout, and so it's important for us to start to think in terms of not simply the names of pieces and where they come from, but also themes that connect pieces with one another. And so it's important to note that when we begin with the Woman of Willendorf, or the Nude Woman of Willendorf, or Venus of Willendorf, the female form is a topic of art from the Paleolithic era all the way to the present. And in class we've actually seen images all the way up already to the 19th century and into the 20th century with Gorilla Girls as well. So the issue of gender and representation, and of the human figure and the human body, is an ongoing theme that is important to remark upon and to think about when we look at these pieces. So we have a Paleolithic counterexample to examine as well in the book, where man, as opposed to woman, makes one of his earliest appearances, and indeed we can flip back a couple of slides and look at the torso with the feline head. There's speculation whether this is supposed to be some type of cat, or if this is a person with a cat head or cat mask. But it is, in some ways, a counterexample to the Women of Willendorf and the various other Venuses of the Paleolithic era. So again, when thinking of AP art history themes, consider not only gender but the human body as well. And we've watched a video in class about kind of the neuroscience behind representing the human body and speculation that it might be related to biological impulses towards exaggeration and pleasure. That's neither here nor there, but something to consider. So for instance, how are certain features of the female form exaggerated while others are not? Theorize why the unknown artist created his or her subject. We do not know the gender of this artist. Is this a fertility idol, as is often assumed? Are there other possible explanations? Looking forward, the next page of our guide, we have a little micro tip: narrative art. So narrative art that should probably be in bold, actually. I think this is a very strong theme. Again, narrative art is anything that tells a story, any piece of art. And it's important for you to consider how narrative art is also there from the beginning, even at the moment prior to the invention, quote-unquote, the invention of writing. For narrative composition, Gardner's glossary tells us it is elements in a work of art arranged in such a manner as to tell a story. And so when we're looking at some of these cave drawings, or something to consider is the arrangement of the figural object, the figural composition of the course of the piece, to see that is this telling a story? Is this some randomized collection of animal representations, or is this actually arranged? Is there intention, and is that intention part of a larger narrative, a larger story? The AP Art History exam, this is important to note, will no longer use art from prehistory for the student-free response questions, essay questions. Although you will have multiple choice that can be taken from this period, and so you need to be able to cite images from all kinds of art historical periods in the free response, both in the long and the short. They're not going to ask you in the question about Paleo or Neolithic art, but you can use examples, and there could very well be a multiple choice set of questions on them. So it's just good to have, and I think that it's a disservice to you if you go through an art history course and you don't learn about the various Venuses of prehistory. Here we have our key vocabulary, just 16 words for this chapter: gender in art. narrative in art, prehistory, Paleolithic art, Neolithic art, wall paintings, incising, ground line, modeling, high relief, corbelling, post and lintel, menhirs, cromlechs, Stonehenge, and megalithic monuments. When we have key terms and key vocabulary, this is for your note cards, or these words are for your note cards. It will not be comprehensive for the chapter, but trying to touch on the key ones. The same goes, of course, for the images, and here we have images from the first chapter for which you should, that you are responsible for in terms of your image cards and note cards. Alright, and then finally, our last page of the guide, study materials. So throughout, we're going to have a whole range of materials outside the book that you can use. And here we have 2 links provided from Gardner's for you for Stonehenge and the Caves of Lachaux. And then we have underneath that AP-style image concept-based questions and strategies. And what I've done is tried to give you the question as well as the strategy that might be used to answer that question. Right, so we'll just look at one of them, the first one. If you can describe how the woman of Willendorf is presented and discuss why the artist may have portrayed her in this manner. Indeed, this was one of your in-class journal prompts. And so this prompt is a way to introduce a human body as an art subject. For years, the woman of Willendorf, one of about a dozen of such images found, was considered a fertility figure. But that theory has recently been questioned. The anatomical exaggerations are obvious, and you may wish to speculate on the image's purpose, but its meaning, as of all of that of ancient art, remains elusive. And so really what you have to grapple with a lot of these essays, especially early on, is how do you present knowledge that is, how do you present the fact that we don't have knowledge about certain things? In a short essay, you don't need to make things up. You don't need to say that that we don't know the patron. You can simply be straightforward and say this is an unknown matter. Okay. All right, moving on to our chapter tour, and actually we're going to begin with an image that we've actually already seen, that of the Magaganzit pebble art. You'll notice that my pronunciation is absolutely no better than yours. But luckily, you're not being tested on pronunciation. Dating conventions and abbreviations, and I would think that most of you have seen this. You've gone through world history. This should be pretty simple. All right, so we have in the West, traditionally probably up to like the 1970s. I don't really think that this is still used anymore. We've gone with the BC, before Christ era, and AD Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, so 1991 would be 1,991 years since the birth of Christ, supposedly, although I think the dating's off. Nonetheless, we do not do that anymore, and especially not within an academic context, and so it's just one letter, but it makes a difference. It is not BC, but BCE, so before the Common Era. And as likewise, it's not AD, but CE, the Common Era. Down at the bottom, though, are some pretty important abbreviations and conventions for you to understand in art history. C or CA is circa, so much of what we do in art history is actually estimating time periods, and so even some of the most famous pieces of Western art remain elusive in their final dating. And ultimately, when we are taking the AP exam, they're not going to ask you a specific year of a piece, although it's really nice to know, but really largely talking about in the quarter-century era, quarter and half-century time periods, or with Paleolithic art, thousands of periods. And then capital C century, so 19 capital C, 19th century. All right, so let us look again at this map of prehistory. This map of prehistoric Europe in the Near East. First thing to notice about this map is that it is extremely limited. And this is very much one of the ongoing stories about art history and its legacy. For those of us who completed the initial introductory readings, both on kind of the history of the art history book, right, and kind of the interventions of Judy Chicago, and of contemporary art historians and theorists, art history has really much been a story about the West. and that is increasingly under question and deconstructed and critiqued. It is a highly problematic beginning to say that this is where art begins. Nonetheless, it is not our job to redefine the discipline, at least not our job until we actually know it, right? So once you know it, then you can redefine it. We are going to begin, though, not here, but actually further south into the continent of Africa. And yes, so here we have, once again, the Magaspanskat. That's a horrible pronunciation. Magaspanskat. Pebble resembling a human face, estimated at 3 billion years BCE, before the Common Era. And it is really one of the most interesting pieces of quote-unquote art. It is from Africa that we have our earliest evidence of a human recognition of abstract images. And one of the really key dichotomies and contrasts of Chapter 1 is this contrast between recognition versus representation, and we really get this with this pebble. This is a pebble that, as far as we can tell, does not involve the active intervention of a human being in terms of a physical manipulation. Rather, it is a piece of art of recognition and not representation. So in 1925, some explorers in South Africa, they not only discovered a set of kind of pre-human bones, a skeleton, a predecessor of modern humans that lived in South Africa region 3 million years ago. They also found this, this little pebble, which bears, as the book says, an uncanny resemblance to a human face. The nearest known source of this variety of iron stone that is made out of it, this jasperite, is actually coming from 20 miles away. And so if we're going to say anything about human intention and human intervention, it is the fact that this is a piece of actual stone that is not indigenous to the area in which it was found. So at some point, one of these early humans, and I mean this is not even our current subspecies of human, right, took refuge in a rock shelter and must have noticed this pebble, once again speculation, in the stream bed, and kept it. Right? That's as far as we know. The real question is this art? And I think from a contemporary and modern point of view, many artists have certainly looked at this as a piece that reminds them of some type of human universal need to create or recognize or alter objects from their normal context and then label them art. And so your chapter also talks about a very famous kind of artistic experiment by Marcel Duchamp in 1917, in which he takes a ceramic urinal, flips it on its side, and calls it a fountain, and certainly is one of the defining pieces of the 20th century. And so is that, in many ways, so many millions of years later, the same type of maneuver of recognition versus representation? The chapter is not going to tell you, it's not going to answer the question, it's just going to pose it. All right, wonderful. We jumped nearly 3 million years in history with one slide. This is, I think, the third time I've recorded this slide, so hopefully we'll see if I get it right this time. So, as the book notes, when we get from that space of time between the pebble resembling a human face and these series of fragments of the Paleolithic era centered around the Apollo 11 cave, as well as the Wonderver cave in the southern portion of Africa around 2300 BC. In this transition of 3 million years, we move from recognition to the act of representation or representing. So we get human intervention upon objects in order to recreate in some figural way or another the life around them. Paleolithic literally translates from the Greek as old and stone, so paleo and lithos for stone, so the old stone age. And around 30,000 years ago, 30,000 BCE, there was a pretty powerful outburst of creativity And we see this in the wide gamut of artistic output by the Paleolithic peoples that we've found so far. Everything from monumental paintings and engravings to relief sculptures, sculptures in the round, and murals. And so it's a pretty fecund and creative period, actually, in human history and human art, even if so much of it still remains speculative. And so what we see here is actually one of the earliest pieces yet discovered of a human representation, of a human-created representation. Between 1969 and 1972, scientists working in the southern area of Africa around Zambia came across 7 fragments of stone plaques with paint on them, including 4 or 5 which actually had recognizable images of animals, and we actually see one here. Scientists remain uncertain of what species of animal this represents, and there are others that actually includes one with a stripe that could be a zebra. It's really completely open to speculation. What they have managed to do, however, is to provide a date, and this largely comes from the charcoal on the archaeological layer in which these plaques were found, and so they're able to determine that this is approximately from 23,000 BCE. Like every artist in every age, and this is coming from your book, in every medium, the painter of the Apollo 11 plaque, seen here on the right, had to answer 2 questions before beginning work, although of course we're putting these words into this artist's mouth. What will be my subject and how will I represent it? In Paleolithic art, the almost universal answer to the first question was an animal, and that is really important to get through to you, that Paleolithic art is kind of obsessed with artistic representations of animals, everything from bison, mammoth, and horses, right? In fact, Paleolithic painters and sculptors only very infrequently, rarely depict human beings, and most often they're women, and very extremely rarely of men. And it's pretty stark contrast from today's world. Again, this is coming right from your book. During the Paleolithic era and into the Mesolithic and Neolithic, nearly every single animal that these people came in contact with found some manner in which to get represented. And so this also becomes an issue of variety versus originality in art. Nearly every single representation coming out of this era is one of strikingly similar look and feel. All right, continuing to explore that wide swath of time between 3 million BCE and the Paleolithic era, we're moving away from the southern area of the African continent straight into the heart of Europe and into Germany, at specifically Holstenstein-Stadel. And Holstenstein-Stadel actually becomes well known for the discovery of several of these, and these are generally called humans with feline heads. There is some speculation whether it's supposed to actually just be a complete feline body, but it is one of the earliest sculptures ever yet discovered. It is made out of ivory. It has been dated as far back as 30,000 BCE, and it was found not completely intact, but in fragments inside a cave at Holstenstein-Stadel in Germany, and it was pretty meticulously restored. So it's carved out of mammoth ivory, and it's nearly a foot tall. It's actually quite big, a huge sculpture for this era. The statuette, it represents something that existed only in the imagination of whatever unknown sculpture. We presume there were not felines walking around during the Paleolithic era. It is human. Whether male or female is pretty much hotly debated, so there is no definite gender to it. It is a composite figure, meaning it combines elements of animalism with human body, and vice versa. And as we get further into both the Paleolithic, Neolithic, and then later in the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt eras, we're going to find this type of mixture or hybridity and composite figuration continues. No one knows what the people who made this had in mind when they made it. Other Paleolithic human-headed animals have been interpreted as humans dressed up as animals. Others have been interpreted as actual, like, walking animal, like spirit things, right? So in the absence of any type of written explanation, because there was no real writing at the time, no writing, we can only speculate onto the purpose and function of a statue like this. And I think what's interesting is the speculation about the Holstenstein-Straddle feline figures is really kind of dramatically different than the ones for instance, Willendorf, which we're going to see in a minute. It's almost as if we can't quite grapple with how to deal with a composite character like this, which is so much less, I find, less exaggerated than that of the Willendorf or the other Paleolithic Venuses. Art historians do say, however, that these statues were considered important, and we can get that it was important simply because of the amount of time and effort that went into the creation of them. I remember this is a foot tall. It was a complicated process to create. You had to remove a tusk from a dead animal. You had to cut where the eye rejoined the head. This is very kind of labor-intensive work here. And then you had to cut the tusk. You had to size it down. You had to rub it into an approximate final shape, right? You had to use some type of sharp stone blade to carve the body, the limbs, and the head. You had to use something called a stone burin, which is a pointed engraving tool to incise, to scratch lines into the surfaces. So all of this took several days at least, and involved a great amount of time. This is a sculpture in the round, to use the term. This is a freestanding sculpture that can be seen from 360 degrees. And here we have one of our most famous Paleolithic sculptures on the right, the Venus de Willendorf. Some of the key concepts that we're going to explore with Paleolithic art is to ask why art has to be intentional and representational in order to be called art. To look at why subject matters were depicted in a particular way. We called this stylistic innovation, and we looked, of course, already at the Paleolithic Nambian animal plates as well. And to describe the roles of animals and human figures in Paleolithic art, I think we got that covered. Key concepts to also consider is examining the nature and reasons for the earliest sculpted forms, the majority of which were stylized depictions of women. We talked a lot about that in class, but it's really important to keep in mind. And I just talked to you about sculpture in the round versus high relief sculpture. We're actually going to see the difference between the two visually to help you kind of understand that. Going back to the map, we're going to move a little east from Holstenstein-Straddle to Willendorf, where we're going to look at really one of the most famous images and sculptures of all time. So we can call this piece any number of names. Anytime you want to refer to it in particular, you're going to have to use the place name of Willendorf. And so this is the Venus de Willendorf, the nude woman of Willendorf, the woman of Willendorf. Any of these would be fine. And so unlike the feline human statue that we just saw, from Holstenstein-Straddle, this one, the Venus, is actually much more prominent for a Paleolithic sculpture, and that's because nearly all Paleolithic art consists nearly exclusively of representations of women as opposed to men or even composite creatures. So it's usually going to be all animal or all woman, and that at least in what we've found so far. Right? Scholars generally assume during the Ice Age that men and women wore clothing to cover their bodies, yet nonetheless so many of the human figured forms, which are of course gendered largely as women, are indeed nude. These statuettes have been dubbed Venuses, in a sort of ironic commentary, and this is coming very much out of the 19th and 20th century kind of agenda with gender representation. They've been called Venuses after the Greco-Roman goddess of beauty and love, Venus, who was also nearly always depicted as nude. The book says that this nickname is inappropriate and misleading. You can still use that term, Venus, although it is perhaps better just to say woman of Willendorf. So one of the oldest and most famous of these prehistoric female figures, the Venus of Willendorf, is a limestone figurine, a woman who was found in Austria, in Willendorf, It is, and as I'll read it for the chapter, its cluster of almost ball-like shapes is unusual, the result of part of the sculptor's response to the natural shape of the stone selected for carving. And we've actually seen some videos that go back and forth, whether it was the stone or simply the utter exaggeration on the part of the artist. The anatomical exaggeration has suggested to many that this and other similar statues served as fertility images. Other Paleolithic stone women who are far more slender actually do exist, and the meaning of all of these images remains largely elusive. There does seem to be a Paleolithic preoccupation with representations of women, and the book speculates that, and art historians speculate that a lot of this has to do with a focus on the childbearing capacities and capabilities of women in Paleolithic society and culture. One thing is clear: the Venus of Willendorf sculptor did not aim for naturalism in terms of shape and proportion. And so, as with most Paleolithic figures, the sculptor did not carve any facial features. Here, the carver suggests only a mass of curly hair, or some researchers have argued that this is actually a type of woven hat, and so this actually could be the first kind of figuration of a clothed human, but no face, right? No eyes, no visible visage, right? The breasts of the Willendorf women are enormous. They're far larger than the tidy forearms and hands that rest upon them. And yet the carver also took pains to scratch into the stone all manner of kind of sexualized detail, not kind of, sexualized detail, which is perfectly apparent here. Indeed, in addition to the tiny arms and forearms, also the feet themselves are also tiny. And so we can see, sort of, or speculate, what this artist was really focusing on. Sculptors often omitted some of these sexualized details in Paleolithic sculptures, and so many scholars have actually begun to question that these were even fertility images. But whatever the purpose of the statuette, the maker's intent seems to have been to represent not a particular woman, but rather kind of the female form, and that's an important distinction to be made, especially with this object. Here we have some additional images of the Venus of Willendorf. As we've seen in class, you can visit in Austria in the Natural History Museum. You can go in and press the button and shine a red light on her, and they'll play some flute music for you. She is 4 1/4 inches high, so she is well under the size of the previous composite human-feline hybrid that we saw further west in Germany from around the same period. Our next set of pieces, we're going to go further west into the heart of France. We're going to look at Le Chaux, La Salle, and Pechmer, and actually to a series of images of Paleolithic women that, on the one hand, kind of both reinforce the message or the image of Willendorf, as well as give us kind of an insight into a differing technique of Paleolithic sculpture. So here we have two more Paleolithic Venuses, and these are, once again, in some ways even more abstract, right, and non-representational or non-realistic as the Woman of Willendorf. They are both still nonetheless about the same size as the Woman of Willendorf, from about 8,000 years difference based on our estimations, and they are both sculptures in the round. Now what we see with various of these European Venus figures is again this real focus on anatomical exaggeration. One of the more interesting pieces to come out in this kind of vein does come from La Salle, and that is the Woman of La Salle. And this is coming from the La Salle region in France, and it's from about 25,000 to 20,000 BCE. It is limestone, it is painted, and what is key is that this is a relief style sculpture. Unlike sculpture in the round, which is freestanding, you could see all the way around it. We actually saw the art historian carrying the Woman of Willendorf in class. The LaSalle woman is actually a relief sculpture in which the sculptor employed a chisel in order to cut into a flat surface of a large rock. And so when the sculpture does this, they create an image that projects from its background, and hence the term relief. It's important for you to understand the different types of techniques that go into the creation of these pieces of art. Also, what's interesting about the LaSalle woman is that this was originally painted. There is speculation, widely assumed to be true, that the woman of Willendorf and that many of the other Venuses were also painted as well. It was painted with a type of red ochre, which is a naturally colored mineral, and this mineral is also found on the Venus of Willendorf. And so many of these stone sculptures were actually painted and in some ways quite vivid in their painting as they would have appeared 25,000 years BCE. Now the LaSalle etching is about 1.5 foot tall, which is larger than the freestanding Venuses. It is part of a great stone block. It is in the open air, and so this is in the front of a Paleolithic rock shelter. And these rock shelters were a common type of dwelling for early humans, along with huts and mouths of caves. And so there's almost an architectural aspect to the LaSalle woman. It is one of many examples of open-air art of the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age. And so it's not simply that humans lived in caves, rather they often use the space around them to create and represent the world that was happening. With our next little map, we're going to go a little south to Le Toc de Audubert. I think that's pretty good. Le Toc de Audubert. And we're actually going to now get into some of cave sculpture and representation. So Paleolithic sculptors sometimes created reliefs by building up forms out of clay rather than cutting into stone blocks, and this is known as additive rather than subtractive, right? So we've really jumped in time, so sometime between 15,000 and 10,000 BCE, here we see this type of additive relief in a cave in Le Toc de Audubert, in which a master sculptor modeled a pair of bison in clay against a large, irregular, freestanding rock. These two bison, which you see here, like much of the older painted animals from the Apollo 11 cave all the way back 30,000 years BCE, are in strict profile. Each is about 2 feet long, and they are among the largest of the Paleolithic sculptures that we have yet found. The sculpture brought the clay from elsewhere, and that's really key. Brought the clay from elsewhere in the cave complex, modeled it by hand into the overall shape of the animals. The artist then smoothed the surfaces with a spatula-like tool, and finally used fingers to shape the eyes, the nostrils, the mouth, and the manes. And the cracks of the two animals actually have resulted from the drying process, and they probably appeared within days of the actual creation of them, so the artist would have presumably seen them. There is a level of detail about these two bisons that is really just quite amazing, and the human capacity to create such realistic versions and visions of the animal life around them is pretty spellbinding. We can almost see the movement of the sculptor's hands here, and the way that this clay was brought to this place to create this image of this animal. Alright, next we move to Bellon-Pont d'Arc for one of the more recent and spectacular discoveries involving Paleolithic art. And these are the Chauvet cave paintings, currently dated from around 30,000 to 28,000 BCE, and they are one of the more spectacular archaeological finds of the past century, and these were only discovered in December of 1994 and announced a few months later in 1995. There have been reports throughout the 20th century, throughout the past 100 years, of such similar finds of prehistoric Paleolithic art, and many of these have actually turned out to be forgeries. This is a tourist industry in France and in parts of Spain, and it is a draw, although for most of the actual caves you can no longer go in as a tourist. But these are not considered forgeries. These are real. The paintings in the Chauvet Cave, which was named after actually the leader of the expedition who found them, Jean-Marie Chauvet, are authentic. No one at the time of their discovery in 1994 could do an accurate dating. It is only since 1994 that we've done radiocarbon dating, which has allowed us to establish that these are actually some of the oldest cave representations around, and they are actually older than what had previously been conceived of as the oldest cave paintings in Altamira. These are actually significantly older. And what this new date, 30,000 to 28,000 BCE, did is that it actually caused art history to be rewritten, and rewritten relatively quite recently. And so our understanding of Paleolithic art has pretty significantly changed over the past 20 years, and it's made scholars reevaluate how we have thought about stylistic development from simple to more complex forms during the prehistoric era. And we can see this in the Chauvet Cave, in the density and complexity of these representations. If we were to look at the horns on what are wild oxen, these are a type of auroch, which are in a form of a long extinct oxen, is that there is a degree of dimensionality, of shadowing, of near three-dimensionality in the Chauvet Caves, and that there is a great degree of naturalism. So even if we think back to the kind of animal plaques back in Nambia and Apollo 11 cave, or even to the feline human composite, I mean, these images in these caves are far more realistic, far more naturalistic than even those. There's a lot of research that still remains to be done and conducted in these caves. Some archaeologists have actually contested the early dating of these cave dwellings, but there is an assumption that these are actually the oldest cave dwellings yet to be found. On an interesting side note, Austrian director Werner Herzog has actually recently made a movie about these very dwellings and gone into them, and I highly recommend it if you're into cave dwellings. Alright, we're moving on from Belle and Pont d'Arc and the Chauvet Cave Complex to the cave complexes of Peshmer, eventually Les Chaux. Now, prior to the discovery of the Chauvet Caves, Peshmer and Les Chaux, along with Altamira, which we'll talk about momentarily, were considered kind of the crown jewels of the cave painting genre. And at Peshmer, we do get some really wonderful kind of naturalistic images of Paleolithic animal life. Over here on the left, we have a representation of a woolly mammoth, and there is something of grace and simplicity to the artistic lines that have gone into creating this really kind of a spellbinding visual image of the woolly mammoth. Both of these are currently dated to about 22,000 BCE, so these are somewhat significantly more recent than perhaps those at Chauvet. On the right, we get this really wonderful interplay of geometric shapes, of dots and lines, and almost a sense of three-dimensionality with this layering of animals on top of one another. And quite importantly, we also get the handprint of the Paleolithic human, and you can see it kind of surrounding the animals. These handprints have become quite famous, especially with the Peshmer cave paintings. And they were created, presumably, by the artists placing their hand against the rock and either blowing or spitting pigment out on it to create this positive image. Now, scholars have looked at these handprints as a type of signature of the artist. That's completely speculation, or even as some type of commitment to a membership of a religious community around these animals, or even ownership of kind of the hunting of the animals. Some recent work has actually called into question whether these handprints are actually contemporaneous with one another, or if in fact they might have differ for up to thousands of years between the placement of them. Now, often with cave paintings, the actual materials used to create these images would be actually mixed on the flat rock itself, and almost using the rock as a palette. Moving quickly on further to the west to Altamira and to the Altamira cave complex. These are pretty significantly more recent than the Chauvet caves at around 12,000 BCE. Some go even further, about 15,000 BCE, but 12,000 to 11,000 BCE. And here we get, again, pigment on stone and kind of this mass gathering of Paleolithic animal cave paintings. And here this kind of gives you a little bit of scale and understanding of what it actually took to create these. And so we see it took not only the effort of gathering materials, but really kind of dragging it into the dark inner recesses of a cave. This took multiple people, and it took a great deal of human intention and intervention on the part of these early artists. Going back over to Le Chaux in order to look at kind of the dance of the bulls in the Le Chaux cave complex. This is certainly one of the most famous of the cave drawings of Paleolithic, the Hall of the Bulls. Again, you can sort of get a little bit of perspective there if you look at the kind of walkway that has been built to help walk visitors through the cave complex. Access to these caves is extremely controversial and in most cases has become quite restricted in recent years. The Le Chaux cave paintings from about 15,000 to 13,000 BCE, and here we get again a kind of a detail look at Le Chaux. One of the things that always strikes me is the sense of movement that comes out of this. When Werner Herzog was looking at the French cave drawings for his recent documentary on the subject, he insisted on actually bringing flame into the caves. Because remember, what we're seeing here is a flattened, kind of fluorescentized image where, you know, we have these big lights that can provide constant sources of illumination. But in fact, these caves would have been illuminated by indeed fire, which would have caused kind of a dappling of shadow effect on these animals, which I think even highlights movement more. Again, we also see a certain amount of three-dimensionality. We have layering of animals on different levels of plane. One of the things that always comes up with these cave paintings as well is the issue of ground lines. Is this meant to represent animals all in one place, or is this indeed kind of prehistoric jumble or hodgepodge of just multiple animals just put up there in some type of abstract arrangement? The Le Chaux cave complex in particular proved quite pivotal in modern art, since along with Altamira, these were often utilized by many artists throughout the 19th, but especially the 20th century avant-garde movements as kind of a harkening back to a type of primitive artistic impulse that could prove useful for rejuvenating art of the contemporary era. Here we have another level of detail, especially if we look at this oxen on the left and the horse in the upper right. Really a tremendous amount of detail has gone into these. Alright, thank you for watching. That's about almost an hour-long lecture on Paleolithic art, and this does mark the end of part 1.